What if the biggest obstacle standing between you and the life you want is not your circumstances, not your past, and not your lack of resources, but the story your brain has decided is true about you? Here is something most people never stop to consider. The version of yourself you wake up as every single morning, your fears, your habits, your automatic responses, your sense of what is possible, none of that is fixed. None of it is permanent. Every single piece of it was constructed. And anything that was constructed can be reconstructed. That is not a motivational slogan. That is neuroscience. Today, we are going to go deep into the psychology of self-transformation. Not the surface-level version you read in a listicle. The real mechanics. The reason change feels like it is going to kill you. The reason your brain literally fights against the person you are trying to become. And the reason that, once you understand what is actually happening inside your mind, transformation stops feeling impossible and starts feeling inevitable. Let us start with something that most people get completely wrong. We like to think of change as a decision. You decide to be different, and then you are different. That is the version sold to us by productivity culture, by motivational speakers, by the idea that all you need is enough discipline and enough willpower. But psychologists have known for decades that this model is deeply flawed. Real transformation is not a decision. It is a process of identity reconstruction. And the difference between those two things is everything. Dr. Carol Dweck, a psychologist at Stanford University, spent decades studying why some people grow through difficulty while others collapse. Her research, published in her landmark book Mindset, identified something she called a growth mindset, the foundational belief that your abilities, your intelligence, and your character are not fixed traits, but are qualities that develop through effort and experience. The people who changed the most profoundly were not the ones with the most willpower. They were the ones who genuinely believed that change was possible for them. That belief was not a side note. It was the engine. Because the brain does not respond to what you want. It responds to what it believes. And there is a profound difference between those two things. To understand why transformation is so difficult, you have to understand what your brain is actually doing most of the time. Neuroscientist Dr. Joe Dispenza, drawing on decades of research in epigenetics and quantum biology, describes the brain as a record of the past. Approximately 95% of what you do, think, and feel every single day is driven by subconscious programs, automatic patterns that were formed through repetition, often in early childhood, and have been running quietly in the background of your life ever since. Your reactions, your emotional defaults, your assumptions about your own worth, your invisible ceiling on what you believe you deserve. These are not conscious choices. They are encoded habits of perception. The brain is wired for efficiency. Repeated experiences get consolidated into neural pathways, well-worn roads the brain travels with as little energy as possible. This is actually a remarkable feature of the human mind. It allows you to function without having to consciously analyze every single moment. But it also means that by the time you reach adulthood, most of what you think, feel, and believe has become deeply automatic. You are, in many ways, running on autopilot. And here is the critical insight. Changing behavior without changing the underlying neural program is like trying to drive a new route using an old map. The brain will keep pulling you back toward what is familiar. This is where neuroplasticity becomes one of the most powerful concepts in modern science. For most of the 20th century, mainstream science held that the adult brain was essentially fixed, that after a certain point in development, the structure of your neural architecture was more or less set in stone. That belief has now been comprehensively dismantled. Research by neuroscientist Michael Merzenich, who is considered one of the pioneers of neuroplasticity, demonstrated conclusively that the brain retains the ability to reorganize itself throughout life. Every time you learn something new, practice a new skill, or consciously choose a different response to an old situation, the brain physically rewires itself. New synaptic connections form. Old, unused pathways weaken and eventually fade. You are not simply changing your behavior. You are changing the hardware. This is not metaphor. It is measurable biology. Studies using functional MRI imaging have shown that mindfulness meditation, the practice of sustained, non-judgmental attention, can actually increase gray matter density in the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for reasoning, emotional regulation, and long-term decision-making. In a landmark study conducted by researchers at Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital, participants who practiced mindfulness for just 8 weeks showed measurable structural changes in the brain. 8 weeks. That is the timeline for neurological transformation. The brain is not a fixed landscape. It is a living, adaptive system, and it changes in response to how you use it. But here is the paradox that trips up almost everyone who genuinely tries to change. The brain resists transformation, not because it is broken, but because it is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Psychologists call this homeostasis. Your nervous system is continuously working to maintain a stable, predictable internal state. When your thoughts, behaviors, or emotional patterns begin to shift in ways that diverge from your established identity, the brain experiences that divergence as a threat. It generates discomfort. It creates anxiety. It manufactures doubt. It whispers that you were fine the way you were, that this is too hard, that you are fooling yourself. That internal resistance is not a sign that you are failing. It is a sign that the process is working. Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, a neuroscientist at Northeastern University and author of How Emotions Are Made, explains that the brain is fundamentally a prediction machine. It is always anticipating what comes next based on what has come before. When you begin acting in ways that do not match the predictions your brain has already built for you, when you speak up instead of staying silent, or rest instead of overworking, or set a boundary where you once collapsed, the brain receives a mismatch signal. That mismatch feels uncomfortable, and most people interpret that discomfort as evidence that something is wrong, when in reality, it is evidence that something is changing. This is also why behavioral change without identity change almost never holds. Think about the person who sets a resolution to exercise every day. For 2 weeks, they push through. Then life gets complicated, motivation dips, and gradually the habit fades. Within 2 months, they are back where they started, and they blame themselves for lacking discipline. But discipline was never the real problem. Dr. James Clear, whose work on behavioral design in his book, Atomic Habits, has been backed by substantial research, argues that the most effective agents of lasting change do not focus primarily on what they want to achieve. They focus on who they want to become. When you shift from asking, "How do I get myself to exercise?" to asking, "What would a person who genuinely values their health do in this situation?" something fundamental changes in the motivation architecture. The behavior is no longer a forced performance. It becomes an expression of identity, because identity, once genuinely internalized, generates behavior automatically. It does not require willpower. It requires only consistency of self-concept. But where does identity come from in the first place? Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung spent much of his career exploring this exact question. Jung proposed that the personality we present to the world, what he called the persona, is largely a construction shaped by early socialization. As children, we are acutely sensitive to the signals of our environment. We learn, often without words, what behaviors earn approval and which ones provoke rejection. We begin to hide the parts of ourselves that feel dangerous to show and to amplify the parts that keep us safe and loved. Over time, That constructed persona becomes so habitual that we lose sight of the fact that it is a construction. We mistake our adaptive mask for our actual self, and we build an entire life around protecting and maintaining that mask. Jung called the collection of disowned qualities the shadow, not a sinister concept, but simply the parts of yourself that were pushed underground by early conditioning. His insight was that genuine psychological maturity, what he called individuation, required the gradual reintegration of those disowned parts, not fixing the self, not disciplining the self into submission, but becoming whole, accepting the full complexity of who you actually are. That process is deeply uncomfortable. It requires looking honestly at the places you have been hiding, the fears you have been avoiding, the narratives you have been telling yourself that simply are not true. And that is precisely why it is transformative. There is a concept in developmental psychology called the liminal phase. The word liminal comes from the Latin word limen, meaning threshold. It describes the uncomfortable in-between space, after you have left the old version of yourself behind, but before the new version has fully stabilized. That space, that pause between what happens and how you react, is where self-transformation lives. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It arrives in the quiet moment when you notice an old pattern rising, and you choose, even once, to respond differently. Every time you inhabit that pause, you are doing something that is simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. You are exercising conscious agency over a brain that would prefer to run its automated programs undisturbed. And over time, those small moments of choice accumulate into something the old version of you would not recognize. Transformation does not arrive with a dramatic announcement. It does not appear on a specific date. It reveals itself slowly, in retrospect, in the conversations you no longer find draining, the fears you no longer find paralyzing, the limitations you once accepted as permanent that you have quietly dismantled. And it does not end. The most important insight about self-transformation is that it is not a destination you reach and then inhabit permanently. It is a continuous process of expanding awareness. Every threshold you cross reveals the next one. Every layer of conditioning you release exposes another layer beneath. This is not a discouraging reality. It is a liberating one, because it means that no matter where you are in your life right now, the architecture of what is possible is not closed. The brain is waiting to be reshaped by your choices. Your identity is waiting to be reconstructed by your awareness. Your life is waiting to reflect the person you are still, quietly, in the process of becoming. You have not arrived at the final version of yourself, and that is exactly where the most important work begins.